Well, good evening, everyone. I want to begin by thanking all of you for taking time out of your busy weeks to attend this event. I also want to thank Angela Cantola and the Colorado Renewable Energy Society and New Energy Colorado for inviting me to give this presentation. While it has become normal for me to think and talk about the impact that food has on planetary health, I have to remember that this is not discussed nearly as much as it ought to be. Pair that with the confusion caused by divergent voices vying for people's attention on the internet and elsewhere, and we have an unfortunate under-awareness of the potential impact that we have for good through our daily food choices. As we dive into this content tonight, I want to share a bit about my personal background. If you had told me 10 years ago that I'd be eating more or less, quote, vegan in 5 to 7 years' time, I would have balked. I'm the girl who ordered Meat Lover's Pizza. When more and more people were giving up dairy due to lactose intolerance, I would pray that I wouldn't be next. I couldn't imagine saying goodbye to cheese, ice cream, Greek yogurt, butter, and more. And when it came to plant foods, I didn't care much for beans, aside from bacon-laden, overly sweet baked beans, and I couldn't understand why anyone would ever put them in a red chili. So as we get started, hopefully you can hear me say loud and clear, I didn't start out this way. I wasn't propagandized by PETA in elementary school. I wasn't raised in a vegetarian family. Rather, what I came to learn about the impact of our food choices and our food systems on planetary health and bodily health drove my decisions. Over time, I slowly changed the way I ate. The more I learned, the more I changed. But it's essential for me to emphasize the change didn't come all at once. I didn't go from loving meat, eggs, and dairy to celebrating legumes, whole grains, and vegetables overnight. I emphasize this at the front end because I think incremental change is the most promising path to sustainable, lasting impact. As we dig into the data of how food is both a problem and a potential solution to our current climate crisis, I want to make sure that you know I'm not leading toward an altar call of conversion to a vegan lifestyle. Rather, I'm inviting us all to consider, as we look at the facts, what we're able and willing to do with our food choices today and tomorrow, and in the days and weeks to come, to be part of the solution. And keep this in mind too. Perfection is not the goal. As we'll see together as we look at the data, the more each of us can do, the better. And the more of us we get involved, the better. It is unlikely we'll get most of the population to eating plant exclusive, but the more we can get folks to opt for meatless Mondays, going vegetarian before dinner, opting for plant milks more of the time, eating less cheese, and so forth, the more we'll put market forces to work and create a more sustainable food system to help support our warming planet. My cards are on the table. I eat predominantly plant exclusive, and I think you should too. But why? Because food is both a climate problem and a potential climate solution. But food's impact for good or ill depends on what food we produce. So which foods are the biggest problems and which can serve as part of the solution? To better understand food as part of the problem, let's look at how food is part of the climate crisis. There are multiple ways that food is part of the problem. Some have to do with how food is grown, raised, and produced. Others have to do with food waste. From a 30,000-foot view, food in general accounts for about 1/4 of all global greenhouse gas emissions. Food. That thing that we eat every day and may not pay much attention to. And to put things in perspective, transport accounts for about 14%. That's less than 1/7. Most of those food emissions, about 77% of them, are from the food that we eat, and about 23% is due to food waste and loss. This slide shows food accounting for about 24% of current global emissions. The numbers can be a bit different depending on how the data are parsed, and a primary differentiator is how food waste is accounted for, as well as other indirect emissions. Project Drawdown, from which I got this data, has distinguished between direct and indirect food emissions, with direct being those such as land use, livestock and manure, deforestation for grazing and animal feed, etc., while indirect accounts for food waste, energy used for food transport, cooking and cooling, processing, etc. In a webinar focused on the impact of food on climate change, Project Drawdown stated that 22% of the planet's emissions come from direct food emissions, and they estimate that an additional 12% come from indirect food emissions. So doing some simple math, we have an estimate of about 1/3 of global emissions being related to food in some way, and most of that has to do with the growing of our food. Zooming in, let's get more specific about how food is such a sizable part of the problem. By far, the largest contribution food is making to climate change is methane production and release. This comes from several sources, but the biggest offender is livestock, especially cows. According to the Carbon Almanac, quote, of the total emissions from food production, about 61% are due to livestock raised for meat and dairy. Let that sink in for a moment. Of all the kinds of food on offer at grocery stores and restaurants alike, well over half of food-based emissions come from just these two animal-based categories, meat and dairy. Another contributor to methane emissions is food waste rotting in landfills. While many of us may expect that rotting food can just become compost and return to the soil, this doesn't happen in an environment where food is surrounded by plastic rather than organic matter. So instead of turning into compost and nourishing the ground, food waste in a landfill just sits there rotting, emitting harmful methane gas. I keep talking about methane. Hang on a minute, you may be thinking, I thought carbon dioxide was the problem. Yes, and greenhouse gases are the problem. Methane is one such powerful greenhouse gas. Like carbon dioxide, it traps heat from the sun, causing the sun's rays to warm the planet. And although methane doesn't stick around in the atmosphere for as long as carbon dioxide does, methane's heat-trapping potential is 84 times that of carbon dioxide over 20 years. So in a time when imminent action is needed to prevent irreversible planetary impact, tackling major methane producers and emitters is essential if we're going to achieve the crucial Paris Agreement targets for limits on global warming. Yes, carbon dioxide will stick around longer, so we still need to take action to reduce our carbon dioxide emissions. But cutting down on methane in a big way right now is vital for avoiding a speedier rate of warming. This is important because climate change impacts often work as a vicious cycle. The impacts of warming have consequences that in turn make climate change worse, and on it goes. Slowing warming now by reducing methane emissions now is an important step to take, and it's one we can take quite easily by attending to our food choices. Again, methane is emitted both during food production, primarily from cows, and through food waste rotting in landfills. With this in mind, we can implement solutions both at the front end and the back end of the food system and our involvement in it. But before we get to those solutions, let's consider two other ways food is part of the problem. After methane production, other major food-related contributors to climate change include deforestation and land use. And these two go hand in hand. As more land is required to either graze animals or to grow food to feed them in feedlots, more forests are being cleared to make this possible. And did you notice that either or? Land is needed for raising livestock for food, regardless of whether it is commercial or grass-fed. Our World in Data states that 60%, that's 60%, of tropical deforestation is due to beef, soy, and palm oil production. And before anyone rails against tofu, let me clarify that 77%, over 3/4 of global soy, is fed to livestock. Only about 7% of total global soy is used for direct human consumption in products like tofu, tempeh, and soy milk and edamame. So let's keep those kinds of things in perspective. Okay, so land is cleared to graze cattle who belch out tons of methane, that much is clear, or to grow crops to feed livestock that are not being grazed, or to produce palm oil to stuff into ultra-processed foods and other household products. While seeing rainforests cut down is obviously a tragic thing, what does the loss of trees in itself have to do with greenhouse gas emissions? Remember learning as a kid that we breathe in oxygen and plants breathe in carbon dioxide? Plants, trees especially, draw down carbon out of the atmosphere and store it. We call these carbon sinks. If you look back at the slide, trees would fall into that gold bar on the right side. It's hard to see, but it says land sinks. Whenever forests are destroyed, huge amounts of greenhouse gases are emitted as we destroy natural land sinks. So not only are the practices that deforestation is making way for emitting more greenhouse gases, for example, grazing cattle, the very act of deforestation itself is a huge emitter. So this is a lose-lose scenario. Let's talk more about the biggest offenders. Take a look at this slide, and I'll give you a bit more help seeing things in the next couple slides, because I know it's small. It shows greenhouse gas emissions per 1,000 calories. This first slide obviously might be a bit tricky to read, so let me make things a little bit clearer. I can draw a line dividing the animal from the plant emissions. Animal foods, those with higher emissions per calorie, lie at the top half of the chart, while the plant foods, those with far lower emissions per calorie, lie at the bottom. Notice also the size of the bars, which I've circled a few. Compare beef from beef herds at the very top. Tofu is that little one there, and the very bottom, almost bottom, is other pulses, so other kinds of beans. So I realize that the exact numbers on this slide are difficult to read, and we'll get into those numbers when we get into solutions, but you can at least visually compare the size of the bars. But Jessica, you might be thinking, what about locally raised grass-fed beef? Surely local food that isn't driven across the states or comes across the ocean from other countries is better for the environment, right? The validity of this argument depends on how much local actually matters to the overall environmental impact of a given food. So how much does local matter? Let's consider the level of impact transportation has on a food's overall footprint. It's one thing to take a, quote, common sense approach to something like this, assuming something must be the case, but it's another thing to put it under the microscope, so to speak, and examine it through scientific data. Dr. Hannah Ritchie, a researcher at Our World in Data, claims that the charge to eat local is, quote, one of the most misguided pieces of advice. She goes on to clarify, saying, quote, eating locally would only have a significant impact if transport was responsible for a large share of food's final carbon footprint. For most foods, this is not the case, end quote. To be clear, she's not saying that eating local makes no difference at all. Rather, she's emphasizing the size of the difference. This may surprise you, and it certainly surprised me to learn this, but the transportation of a given food typically only accounts for less than 10% of its total carbon footprint. And it's far less than 10% for some of the biggest emitters, as we'll get to in a minute. The vast majority of a food's climate impact has to do with various other factors specific to the food item itself, such as land use change and farming practices. Additional potential factors aside from transport include animal feed, processing, retail, and packaging. According to an article by Dr. Ritchie on this very topic, quote, combined land use and farm stage emissions account for more than 80% of the footprint for most foods. Comparatively, she adds, transport is a small contributor to emissions. For most food products, it accounts for less than 10%. Dr. Ritchie further adds, it's much smaller for the largest greenhouse gas emitters. In beef from beef herds, it's 0.5%, end quote. It's so small you can hardly see it on this chart. The red line on the chart for transport for the beef from beef herds is smaller than the leg of the arrow that I'm using to point to it. Taking beef from beef herds as an example then, if only 0.5% comes from transportation, then 99.5% of emissions from beef are caused by other factors, most notably farm stage emissions followed by land use change, which I have circled on this next slide. If transportation only accounts for 0.5% of beef's emissions, does choosing local beef really make much of a difference? I realize that there are other values at play as well when considering whether to eat local. There's supporting locals about relationships in the community, the local economy, and more. But from an environmental point of view, waving the local flag can be a bit of a distraction. Based on the science, eating locally has a relatively small impact compared to other steps that we might take. So what would make a bigger impact? What can we do to lessen the other 90 to 99% of our food's emissions? Dr. Ritchie's conclusion is that it matters far more what we choose to eat than where that food comes from. I've picked on beef a lot, so what about other animal-sourced foods or animal-sourced foods in general? In addition to the emissions produced by animal products, it is worth considering the efficiency of eating animals versus plants for human energy requirements and ultimately for our survival. In simplified terms, all energy that we consume for life ultimately comes from the sun. We are solar powered in some way. However, since we can't perform photosynthesis like plants, we can't get our energy directly from the sun. We need to consume our energy from something else that gets its energy from the sun. Enter plants. Plants get their energy from the sun and they convert it into forms that we can access: proteins, fats, and carbohydrates. Animals also get their energy from the sun through eating plants. When we eat animals or animal products, we get the sun's energy from the plants that the animal ate by eating the animal itself or the animal's byproducts. When we eat animals or animal products, however, we are 2 steps removed. Think of eating plants as buying direct, getting our energy direct from the source, while animals serve as middlemen, bringing us energy 1 additional step removed. But the question is, how efficient are these processes? If we want to get some of our energy through animals, the middlemen, how much does this additional step cost? In other words, how much does it matter what we eat? In short, the answer is it matters a lot. When we outsource our consumption of energy to animal middlemen, gross inefficiencies enter into the system. It turns out that animals are highly inefficient at turning the energy they consume into energy that we can consume, proteins and fats from their flesh, so meat. And well, why is this? Just like you and me, animals need energy simply to stay alive, to exist. So while some of what they consume goes into growing parts of their bodies that can be consumed by us, most of it is used to support the basic processes of living. So breathing, digesting, sleeping, mooing, oinking, pecking, and so on. So what kind of numbers are we talking about? How inefficient are these middlemen? Well, probably no surprise, when it comes to the major sources of meat from agriculture, cows are the least efficient. As massive animals, they require a lot of energy for their basic bodily functions. For every 100 calories a cow eats, it only puts out 3 calories worth of meat. That's 97% energy input lost in conversion. Lambs don't fare much better at an output of only 4 calories of meat per 100 calories consumed. Pigs and chickens do a little bit better at 9 calories and 13 calories of meat respectively, but those are not numbers to celebrate. These statistics indicate that each of these animals waste more than 85% of the calories when it comes to the efficiency of feeding a hungry and warming world. For a bit of additional perspective, 46%, so nearly half of all habitable land, is used for agriculture. Of that land, 77% is used for livestock grazing and animal feed. That means that only 23% of all agricultural land is used to grow crops not used for animal feed. That's where crops for direct human consumption fit in. When we compare what proportion of our calories are provided from animal foods versus plant foods, only 18% globally of our calories come from animal-based foods, while the other 82% of the world's calories come from plants. So to clarify, we use a whopping 77% of our global agricultural land to produce only 18% of our calories. I'm not a mathematician or an economist, but that seems to be an unwise use of our land, water, and energy. especially in a time when imminent action is needed to curb emissions and significantly slow warming and its effects. And keep in mind, the larger the amount of animal food we eat, and therefore the demand of farmers, the more land we're going to need to feed those animals, regardless of whether they are grazed, on pasture, or confined to feedlots. Either we need land to grow feed crops, which is a key driver of deforestation, or we need even more land to graze the animals, which is also a driver of deforestation. Instead of relying so heavily on such inefficient processes, why not cut back our meat and dairy consumption? But Jessica, again, you might be thinking, didn't you say that only 18% of the world's calories come from animal foods? I did. That may not seem like much because it's not, but when we consider the percentage of our protein supply that comes from animal foods, it's 37%. Taking these numbers together, we have two important factors to consider. First, highlighting what a small amount of our calories, 18%, comes from that 77% of land used for agriculture shows what an inefficient use of resources that is. Second, considering that 37% of our protein comes from animal foods shows that we have a significant room for improvement in reducing our reliance upon animal foods for protein, and thus reducing the amount of resources we use in producing those animal foods. It's also helpful to put these percentages into perspective by considering the disparity of animal foods, especially meat, consumption across various countries. Some countries consume a lot, while others consume very little. According to data from 2021, poorer countries such as Burundi, Niger, and Mozambique, all with average GDPs of less than $1,300, had an average supply of less than 11 kilograms of meat per person per year. That's about 24 pounds, averaging out to 2 pounds per month. For comparison, wealthy nations such as the United States, Hong Kong, and Australia, with GDPs around $50,000 to $64,000, had an average meat supply of approximately 110 to 150 kilograms per person per year. On the higher end of that spectrum, that's nearly a pound of meat per person a day. That's at least a tenfold increase in meat availability between some of the poorest and some of the richest nations. Now, it bears noting that in poorer nations where food instability and nutritional adequacy are daily concerns, animal foods may be a vital part of a nourishing diet. So I'm not suggesting that the poorest nations need to cut back on their meat intake. For those in Burundi and Niger, for example, meat may mean the difference between undernourishment and adequacy. But those of us in context here in the States and elsewhere where we have plenty to go around and so much choice available to us, it's well worth considering what an environmentally responsible choice is regarding how much meat we consume. Okay, there's a lot more that could be said, but I think I've painted a pretty clear picture of the problems that animal foods pose to the climate. Let's move on to consider solutions. If animal products generally, and especially red meat, are the biggest emitters and thus the biggest problem, then swapping them out for more plants is the simplest, most straightforward solution. To change food from climate problem to climate solution, most simply, we should eat less animal products, especially beef, and eat more plants instead. In a bit more detail, this looks like making swaps, such as eating lentils, beans, and mushrooms in place of beef, tofu in place of chicken, eggs, and pork, and so forth. As I noted at the start, I encourage solutions to be adopted over time. Start with something. Build a few new habits. Then change something else. Take an approach that allows the changes to become sustainable for you. The aim is for these changes to stick. Only then will we actually make changes to the food system. Let's compare a few potential swaps you might make. So less meat, more plants. Calorie for calorie, various pulses like black beans, chickpeas, and lentils emit only a fraction of what various sources of meat do. These emit only about 1.5% of what beef from beef herds emit. Even if you're swapping tofu for chicken, two foods that are much closer to that red line in the middle, tofu still only emits about 22% of what poultry meat does. Also, notice that I focused this chart on food sources rich in protein. So I'm not trying to compare meat to salad greens. This comparison makes sense because these are the sorts of foods that you'd likely be eating instead of meat. Second, less cheese, more plants. And I know that might hit close to home. Many of us love cheese. In this chart, I show cheese compared to common ingredients used in place of cheese, tofu, and nuts. Like the previous slide, we can see that on a per calorie basis, the plant options are a much better choice. And because I know how much some of us love cheese, I encourage it kind of as a special thing. You don't have to give something up for forever, but how do you create boundaries around some of these things and say, instead of having to have it every day or every time I have X, I have cheese on it, you see it as a special opportunity to maybe have a steak on an anniversary or cheese on the weekend or something like that. Just another idea to plant. Third, we can consider less eggs, more plants. Now, eggs are used for various purposes, and if you're thinking about a swap for a scramble, you can see at the top that I've put a red bar to show the opportunity cost of the emissions saved by opting for tofu over eggs. And by the way, tofu actually has slightly more protein on a per gram basis if you're concerned about that. Below the tofu, then, are other protein-rich plant options that might stand in for eggs or in typical egg-based dishes like a hash. That's why I put potatoes on there as well. Or even nuts and sweet seeds that are often swapped for eggs in baking. Finally, milk options. Plant-based milks are super easy to find these days, from grocery store shelves to our favorite coffee shops. But which option is best? Soy and oat milks appear to vie for the lowest overall environmental impact. If you're looking for something similar to cow's milk in nutrition, especially protein, I would opt for soy milk, which has almost the same exact amount of protein. It has 0 dietary cholesterol because it's plant milk, and it has a healthier fat profile. However, when it comes down to the overall picture, any plant milk is a better option than dairy milk environmentally. At the individual level, it's crucial that we vote with our dollars. Buy fewer animal products at the grocery store and when you're eating out. Opt for plants more or most of the time. You can also invite others to join you on the journey by talking about it and hosting people for dinner and cooking them delicious plant-based meals. That's often how I get to have conversations, is just by hosting people in my home. It is also vital that movement occurs at the corporate and societal levels. While admittedly I am not as familiar with the ins and outs of all the ways to make an impact corporately and societally, I can at least recommend some terrific resources, such as Greener by Default, Good Food Institute, and Better Food Foundation. I encourage you to explore their websites and resources to help your workplaces, schools, and other institutions implement plant-forward options while still preserving freedom of choice and promoting enjoyment in eating. My specialty is to help make sustainable changes to our own individual eating habits in order to move forward and toward more plant-predominant or plant-exclusive ways of eating. So I'm going to finish out my presentation by focusing on practical ways that you can make swaps so that you feel equipped to take action even today. I know it's late, but maybe you're prepping breakfast, or tomorrow. And in particular, I'll provide the 4 steps that I would recommend anyone looking to be more intentional about the environmental impact of their food choices. So step 1, begin reducing how much meat you eat, especially red meat. By far, red meat is the largest greenhouse gas emitter in the realm of food. In general, carbon dioxide emissions from most plant foods are 10 to 50 times lower than most animal foods. Even compared to poultry, red meat emits 10 times more greenhouse gases. And when considering plant-based sources of protein, keep in mind that red meat emits over 60 times more greenhouse gases than protein-rich soy milk. And before you freak out about meeting your protein needs, there's no need to fear. All plants contain all 9 essential amino acids, so as long as you're eating a variety of foods and prioritizing some that are higher in protein, you shouldn't have a problem. Some great swap ideas include, for red meat in particular, include beans, lentils, and mushrooms. For beans, I think of red meat swapping go-tos as black beans and refried pinto beans. Here I easily think Mexican, which I feel like we're really good at making Mexican food here in Colorado. Tacos, enchiladas, soups and stews. Choose whole beans versus refried beans depending on whether you want something somewhat toothsome or if you want something smooth and creamy. You might consider white beans or chickpeas. Those are great in dishes where you might use chicken, like pastas, curries, salads, and more, and they can certainly be used in place of red meat if color and flavor are not that important to you. Lentils also offer a hardiness suitable to substituting meat, especially ground meat. Lentils are great in tacos, lettuce wraps, soups, stews, and there are various kinds of lentils, and some hold their shape easier than others, and so you might want to consider what kind you use depending on what you're using it for. Brown lentils and green lentils are the easiest and the most affordable to use as a meat substitute. Season them as you would your meat and make a swap in your go-to ground meat recipes. And for specific recipe ideas, this is where internet searches, food blogs, and Pinterest really come in handy. Also, check out your local library. There are loads of plant-based cookbooks out there with lots of recipe ideas and inspiration. And as for mushrooms, grilled portobello caps are a lovely substitute for a burger, or slice them into strips for fajitas or tacos. They're also great additions to pastas and stir fries, or you can even cook them up alongside your breakfast in place of sausage. So what about plant-based meat alternatives? Some of you might be wondering about that. These are admittedly pricier than a pound of dried beans, but they are a terrific transitional food or option for those who are not yet on board with giving up the taste and feel of real meat. What's more, in addition to being a far better option for the planet, they are actually healthier for the eater as well. And this may seem counterintuitive given how many ingredients make up something like a Beyond Burger or an Impossible Patty. However, in the meticulously designed swap meat trial, Stanford professor and researcher Dr. Christopher Gardner found that even highly processed plant-based meat alternatives are better for human health than meat. What's more, Gardner didn't put plant-based alternatives up against things like low-quality bacon, salami, and deli meats. He found organic, grass-fed sources of high-quality meat to feed participants, making sure that he put the best versions of either dietary intervention to the test. In this randomized control crossover trial, meaning that all participants participated in both sides, eating plant-based meats or actual meats, participants eating the organic grass-fed meat consistently had greater health risk factors, while those eating the plant-based meat alternatives had lower levels of risk in those same areas. For instance, when either group ate meat, they had higher LDL cholesterol. LDL cholesterol was lower when they ate the plant-based meat alternatives. When either group ate meat, they had higher levels of something called TMAO, which is a risk factor for immune function, inflammation, and heart and vascular disease. And our microbiome makes that when we eat meat. Finally, everyone lost some weight on the plant-based alternatives, and I just find that consistency is remarkable. While there is certainly more to be said, these data are more than enough to at least get our attention. So plant-based meat alternatives are a better choice than meat across the board, and whole legumes and minimally processed soy like tofu and tempeh are an even better choice. So in sum, start wherever you like with your swaps. Just begin by eating less red meat. Step 2, switch to plant-based milks instead of dairy milk. As we just reviewed, all the major plant milks are better options for the environment than cow's milk. My advice is don't overthink the choice too much. Just start with what you like. And if you've never tried one, then maybe you would try cashew milk as an entry point. It's not one of the 4 that I mentioned, but it tends to be particularly creamy, and you might enjoy that if you're used to cow's milk. Personally, I prefer oat milk in my cappuccinos. I think it goes really nicely with coffee. And then I like the nutritional profile of soy milk for everything else. That's what I buy for keeping it home. And by the way, if my mentions of tofu and soy milk, etc., soy is making you squirm, I recommend listening to episode 20 of my podcast, Eating for Eden, where I have a deep dive with a medical doctor on soy, and we bust some soy myths that have been rampant in our culture for years. Step 3 is reduce the amount of food that you throw away. Be aware that this counts both at home and outside the home. So when you're eating out, do you take your leftovers home with you? Do you leave things on your plate that you would have just maybe rather asked to be left off to begin with? At home, do you frequently forget about ingredients that you have and end up tossing them out because they went bad? In addition to being aware of our current habits, asking what we might change, we can also implement new strategies. Eat and creatively repurpose leftovers. And when we're grocery shopping, try only buying what you need or have a clear plan to use. Finally, if you have the ability to compost, by all means, do it. For those of us without a yard, like myself, we still have options. For instance, I keep a compost tumbler on my patio, in my condo patio, but we could certainly all start by reducing what goes into the rubbish bins in the first place. And step number 4, experiment with other food swaps, adding new ones once former changes begin to stick. Having already given some ideas for beans, lentils, and mushrooms, here I'll add just a few more additional swap ideas for white meat, seafood, eggs, and cheese. Tofu, especially super firm tofu, is a fabulous substitute for chicken. And while tofu often gets a bad rap for not having much taste, the beautiful flip side of that is that it's actually a totally blank canvas for whatever you want it to be. It's like the wild card of the plant-based cooking game, and you can win every time as long as you know how to season it properly. I love using tofu in a variety of applications. I'll marinate it with tamari or soy sauce, ginger and garlic for Asian applications. I'll use olive oil, garlic, and herbs for Italian and Greek. Season it well, cut it up into smaller pieces, cook it up, and work it into a dish that you already love. You'll be surprised how well it replaces chicken or even seafood. It can also be used in place of eggs, like a scramble, or thrown into kind of like a breakfast burrito as you see up there. A couple additional tricks for replacing eggs in baking include something called aquafaba, which you may have heard of. That's the liquid from canned chickpeas. It actually whips up into peaks like egg whites. Seeds such as chia and flax can work as binders. Applesauce and mashed banana help to provide that moisture. The internet is full of resources about replacing eggs in baking, and it typically just comes down to what the purpose of the egg is playing in the recipe. Also, you might try various tofu and nut-based swaps for cheeses. By all means, if you want to go give something that's already at the grocery store a try, go for it. But I've also found some delicious and really easy ways to make my own tofu feta and cashew ricotta at home. I have these recipes as well as a cashew cream recipe and a plant-based cream cheese recipe available on my food blog, which I'll have a QR code for later. It's called eatinandme.com. And I can't forget to mention the beloved nutritional yeast, sometimes cutely called nooch. This is a cheesy tasting condiment that you may have seen at the grocery store, and it's a must for any kind of cheesy sauce that you want to make with plant milks, tofu, and or nuts. It's also lovely for topping avocado toast, pasta, popcorn, and much more. One more note about plant-based swaps in general. Regardless of whether something seems meaty or eggy or cheesy or whatever you mean for it to stand in for, serve up plant foods that you and your family love. You're doomed to fail if you aim to introduce a bunch of unfamiliar or worse, despised foods from the get-go. Remember that you can also take a quote meat on the side approach as a way to get your feet wet. For example, if you typically cook up 1 pound of ground beef for tacos, try reducing that to just half a pound and substituting some lentils, refried beans, or black beans for the other half pound. Or better yet, opt for half a pound of white meat instead of red meat and some beans or lentils for the other half. Reduce the meat and amp up the plants. Go at your own pace and start with what you like. Make progress over time. Finally, in case the argument for planetary health weren't enough, eating more plants and less animal products can have additional benefits for health and nutrition, as well as budget. So diets rich in whole and minimally processed plant foods, including fiber and nutrient-rich plant-based proteins like beans and other legumes, soy products, etc. These lead to better health outcomes such as lower risk for cardiovascular disease, dementia, and Alzheimer's, and various other risk factors associated with these and other diseases. And as for budget, with food costs increasing across the board, it's a comfort to know that whole and minimally processed plant foods are some of the most affordable options at the store. There's that QR code I promised. For more ideas and some deeper dives on particular facets of plant-based eating, check out my podcast, Eating for Eden. And as I already mentioned, I also have a food blog, Eden and Me, with recipes that focus on making plant-based eating both simple and delightful. Again, that QR code's up there. It will bring you to edenandme.com where you can find both the recipes, and then there's a tab for the podcast which you can listen to on various platforms. That's just a preview of what it looks like, some of what I've made, and as you scroll you would see more recipes. That's what you'd see when you click on the podcast. You can select Apple, Spotify, Substack, and YouTube. It all is options. There's that QR code one more time. Thank you all again so much for being present here this evening and for your attention. I hope that I can leave you inspired to do your part in caring for the environment by turning what's on your plate from a climate problem into a climate solution. I invite you to make changes that you can sustain. Start where you are, do what you can, and build from there. Thank you.